Episcopalians across the country, and I think some of what I'll share today will illuminate how it really is like a critical part of our presence in the world as Episcopalians to influence U.S. federal policy.
Thanks for sharing that. And if you're interested, sign up. They don't overwhelm you with information. You're all really good writers. I'm really impressed with how succinct they are, getting to the kind of heart of very complex legislation. But you all do, your communications team does just a great job. Okay, so here's what I'll go to next. I want to talk about, we've got a couple of questions that hover around sort of the same topic. And the first one is, I'm always impressed that Episcopal Public Policy Network, how many times they use the word bipartisan. And they don't always use it, but they when they can, they always do. And it looks like it's just really important to your office to use that word where it's appropriate. The last time I saw it was you all just encouraged the church to applaud all of our representatives in light of the recent gun legislation that passed, which was bipartisan. And so tell us why you use that word, why it's so important. We can imagine, but I'd love to hear it in your own words.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. And talking about partisanship and bipartisan in politics is, to clarify those terms, is so helpful. And in terms of bipartisan, an official answer would be General Convention actually instructs us to work in a bipartisan manner whenever possible. What that means sort of practically is being proactive and reaching out to both sides of the political aisle in our advocacy. And that also means, of course, we have Episcopalians in every state who each have their own representative and senators in Congress of different political parties. And it's important that we all still engage with them, regardless of our own political affiliation or their political affiliation. But when it comes to actually being effective in advocacy and changing legislation and policy, having something be bipartisan often leads to a stronger piece of legislation. It can mean, even if they're quote-unquote compromises that may seem slow, it may be a partial step to where we actually want to go, to where we'll still strive to reach. We may get there quicker if we're working in a bipartisan way for a couple of reasons. Sometimes, like currently, the split in Congress is so even. You need just a couple of people on one side or the other to get a piece of legislation across. But in the long term as well, engaging on both sides of the aisle makes us more effective when the power, whoever is controlling Congress or either the House or the Senate, when that changes, we still have established relationships with offices on both sides of the aisle and can continue to advocate, can continue to educate those offices to bring in our Episcopal Church expertise, speakers, experiences into their offices and help move forward legislation, again, regardless of who is in power.
So I love that for a lot of different reasons. I remember, and this was so simple, but it stuck with me about 25 years. I remember in a book on theology, of all things, in seminary that spoke of people of goodwill across the religious and political spectrum. And it's actually stuck with me for 25 years. And I think it's a spiritual practice to really believe that there are people of goodwill across every difference. And I know that's hard. But it seems to me it's a form of hope to really believe that. And it also reflects that we really believe that everybody has a moral conscience and transformation can happen at any moment. So we should never give up hope, even in this strange political world, that someone's mind can be changed and someone's heart can be softened. So I applaud you just for I think there's something profound about that, even though it slows things down, because you're not just trying to, you're trying to build a community and a coalition around these issues. All right, and yet you take clear stands. So this is not a way of watering down the conversation or avoiding difficult conversations about hard topics. So give us an example of when your office, maybe give us, what's the hardest stand or the most controversial stand that your office has taken?
So as I think about the controversial piece of that question, the bipartisan piece, I have felt grateful to be where I am during the Trump administration, in the current, first couple of years of the Biden administration, because I've gained exposure both of Episcopalians across the political spectrum and with members of Congress across the political spectrum, because, as you said, just to reinforce your point, there are people, with, I think, good intentions, with substantive contributions on both sides of the political aisle, or across the political spectrum. I prefer that term. But in terms of the most controversial stands, again, all of our policies come from General Convention, so we're not creating them. But that said, we have, there's a difference to me between the what and the how. I'm going to get back around to your question, I hope. And the what we always keep in mind. That's what our policies really state. What a great example to me, which at one time was controversial, it's maybe less so now, is calling for universal health care coverage or incremental steps toward that end. So that's actually one of, I think, the clearest policies that we have that talks about this is our ultimate goal. It's up here, but we recognize we may have to build up to that. We may not get 100% of what we want now. And so going back to the bipartisan question, if we'd make a compromise, if we support a piece of legislation that gets us 25% or 50% farther or closer to where we want to be, we may support that over still being where we are today and not having that progress. This may not be terribly controversial, but it's one I like this example because it's very specific. So we certainly do a lot of, healthcare is a big field, anti-poverty work is a big, in terms of volume and staff time is a big part of our work. But there was one particular issue. We have policy against prolonged solitary confinement. It is something in the criminal justice system around the world. The United States does not consider it illegal, but the UN and other bodies consider it a form of torture. And so I like that example for a couple of reasons, because it's very narrow. There are ways sometimes where we as Episcopalians, where we as the Episcopal Church can have an impact in something that is meaningful, that is in depth, but is not necessarily front page news all the time. And it also means this isn't necessarily an example where the Episcopal Church has a particular value add other than our voice, other than some of the prison ministries that we have and that experience, but we work in coalition all the time. And for this issue, we work with the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, or NERCAT, who focuses on a number of issues, but one of the central ones is ending prolonged solitary confinement. And so we're able to partner with them. They bring in this really rich expertise on that issue, and we can then bring our voices together, raise our voices together to the U.S. government about that topic. So not controversial, maybe, but I think really represents, some great, positive, hopeful parts of our work.
Yeah, I love, what a powerful example, because it is specific, as you said, and something that is not in the news regularly. So I appreciate the breadth of your vision and care in that regard. So let me tell all of you something. If you're thinking about questions, that's good, because at the end, we're going to get Q&A. I've probably got about 4 or 5 more questions before we get there. But do hold your questions, think about them, and someone will come around with a microphone in just a few minutes to get to them. What I want to shift to next, though, is how, Alan, your office uses theological reasoning and reflection and scriptural stories and wisdom to influence these policies and the stands that you take.
Yeah, so without...
You believe in the Bible?
Yes. We do. I do. We do. Although everyone who's on staff is not necessarily an Episcopalian. Right. That said, we are working for the Episcopal Church, and so our policies, have this basis often in Scripture. But I think a couple of things to me that are important to highlight in that question or on that topic. One, without meaning to sound like a broken record, is going back to the what versus how question. Mm-hmm. And I think more often than not, Scripture may give us some insight into the what, but not necessarily the how. First of all, I think we have a fundamental call to be engaged in the public space. I may wait just a moment. To be engaged in the public square, being involved in politics, it's community decision-making. The government, of course, impacts our communities in every way, shape, or form, from the federal level down to the local. And so I think we are called by Scripture to be engaged. Certainly we have a tradition of it in the Episcopal Church in particular, but I think in Christianity overall. And so there's that fundamental scriptural basis to be involved. I think we can draw values from Scripture, caring for the sick, for the marginalized, for those who are hungry, for welcoming the stranger. But it's very hard, I think, to jump from Scripture to say we need this many billions of dollars for this particular food program in the U.S. federal government. That's a very big leap. We use a lot of other things to inform that, including our church policies, including research. So that's sort of the how. How do we then care for the hungry, right? That's the how. I think we have to answer that from other sources, but we can use our scriptural basis of caring for those who are in need to be motivated to find a calling to be engaged in that work.
Thank you for that. Okay, the Episcopal Church, as I think most of you are aware, is very diverse, spans the entire country, and also includes the Diocese of Haiti, which is one of our largest dioceses. So incredibly diverse, culturally and politically. How is your work received throughout the Episcopal Church?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. Overall, in my role as Church Relations Officer, I'm our primary public face, or the church-facing part of our office. And I find that a blessing because I'll run into people, on the left and the right, both of which who understand the work and they love being engaged. They may have served as a public official themselves, worked as a poll worker, any number of things. And they'll be upset about one thing or another, but they want to be engaged. And I love that about Episcopal audiences and Episcopalians. Over and over and over again, I run into that. So there is, I think, overall an attraction to this work. People used to refer to the Episcopal Church as the Republican Party of Prayer. I think more recently it's the Democrat Party of Prayer. Just for background, we're still way over...
And that's not an aspiration, by the way. Yes. That's we can talk all about that, but that truly is. I mean, how many of you remember that phrase? A few of you. And I remember somebody in my first parish in the Diocese of Alabama said it used to be that the only Democrat in the parish was behind the altar rail, and what they meant by that is the clergy were too liberal. And some of that's all shifted, and the aspiration is never to reflect. I remember Rowan Williams once said, and I just love this. He said that Christians at their best are unhelpful allies or unreliable allies to any political party. And there's a kind of truth in that, actually, that our vision is to engage, but ultimately we really do believe our values are transcendent and come from another source that could never be confined to a moment in time or to a political party.
Well, and I mean, a lot of the issues we try to tackle, there's still problems because we haven't found the solution yet. And so I think it's important for us to understand and learn how to work together to find those solutions. And so until the current Congress, well, even in the current Congress, Episcopalians are overrepresented in terms of the number of members of Congress who are Episcopalians still, versus, the percentage of the overall population. But I think it's the first congressional session, at least in a long time, if not ever, where there are now more Democrat Episcopalians than Republican Episcopalians. So last congressional session, there were more Republican Episcopalians in Congress. But so there's a part of your question. Ask your question one more time.
How your work is received. Do you ever make people frustrated or mad?
All the time, every day. But often it's from a couple of, I think, simple misunderstandings, and I don't mean to say misunderstandings as an insult to the people who offer those critiques, because I love that engagement. I love hearing from people, and I like stimulating conversation. But I think one of the key misunderstandings is this difference between, so we've talked about bipartisan. That means pursuing legislation that's supported by both political parties in some way, or at least members of both political parties, engaging with both sides of the aisle. But nonpartisan is also a critical term. So all of this is political engagement. What we don't do is partisan engagement. So I also lead our civic engagement work. It's a lot of jargon in here. I lead our voter engagement work during election cycles. So it's an election year for the midterms this year. All of that work is nonpartisan, which means we do not support or denounce a political party or a candidate in their capacity running for office. What we do engage in, and that's at the heart of advocacy from a secular perspective, is our constitutional right to petition the government, to hold our elected officials accountable once they are in office, once they have that position. And so a lot of people who, more often than not, the critiques are, why are you being so partisan? Why are you only supporting Democratic legislation? Why are you only supporting this Republican-led initiative? And it's actually that's not our objective, nor is that our reasoning for pursuing something. If Democrats are in power, we're going to be working with them more. If Republicans are in power, we're likely to be working with them more, because that's who has the influence, to make the change in that moment that we want to see. That's different from engagement around election that may be partisan, which is not something we do. So that's the biggest frustration I see, or biggest critique. The other goes, I say it one more time, a difference between how versus what. We may take a different strategy because we would rather make sure there's some progress, even if we can't get 100% of the way there. And so some people will critique. They have a different threshold. They have a different understanding over how much compromise is the right amount. And so they may be upset. Why didn't we should reject this bill because it is only 50% of what we want. We need 100%.
I hear a lot of people lament, and I'm sure you've heard it, the loss or the sidelining of the moderate voice. Do you agree with that the moderate middle is sort of less, less heard, less visible, and a lot of people blame the media for that and other factors. What are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think in some ways they are less heard. Two sort of points before my answer maybe. I am cautious in blaming the media in a sense because I think journalism and media coverage is an essential part of the functioning of our society. And so when critiquing them, I don't want to critique them to a point where we push that aside, right, and say this is not useful. It's to the point where it's not useful because it still is. That said, there is this sort of appeal toward what's going to get the most ratings, what's going to be the juiciest storyline, and I think that's a problem. There's also that pull, I think, for members of Congress. So going back to why I said I'm grateful for being where I am and seeing things behind the scenes, that doesn't mean sneaky, but it just means having a private conversation with someone is different when they're not having to appeal to their constituency in a public way, thinking about the context of elections. The conversation can be very, very different. The tone can be different. But I think advocacy organizations in some cases as well, and activists can sometimes contribute to this too, and again, I think this is the fourth time I've said this, I think, it's the difference between how versus what. And it's understanding that as pressing as matters of injustice are, as day-to-day living for people who are experiencing that can be so painful, we're not in a neutral world, and it's going to take time to address those injustices. It's just going to. That's what history tells us. That's what leaders across time have told us. And so we hopefully can take positive steps in the right direction while keeping ultimate goals in mind. And I think sometimes people forget that difference, and they're overwhelmed, maybe, and understandably so, by that day-to-day experience of injustice.
Again, we're about to open up for Q&A, so don't lose your questions, but just two last ones before we do that. One is, let's do just a little bit of time on why legislation is so important from a religious standpoint. So we do a lot of work here at the Cathedral, have forever, so it's nothing new, with Metro Caring. And one of the things I love about Metro Caring is they do a brilliant job of caring about what I would call a spectrum of responses to injustice. So to be super concrete, they love loaves and fishes. We do it every July. And we preach that gospel reading, and you show up and you're super generous with grocery bags, and they include food and sometimes toiletries and things like that. And then the opposite end, and forgive me for oversimplifying, of that spectrum, I almost fell off this chair. I got to watch my hand motions there. It's a little slippery up here. The other end of now I'm distracted, Enrique. I apologize to everyone on the live stream. It's easy to forget that we're live streaming sometimes, and I need to do a better job of that. The other end of the spectrum, as I try to recover, is legislation. And I've written actually 2 advocacy pieces about legislation that relates to food insecurity with Metro caring. So you see what the spectrum is. I know you care about that spectrum too. We just say a little bit about why all of that matters.
So this reminds me of the question you asked about, critiques or people who how is this received? And one of the ways I try to approach advocacy is that it's just simply one way among many that we can, as Christians, as Episcopalians, work to address need and injustices in our communities. And so as an end to that, I often encourage more skeptical folks to think about, or even skeptical parishes, to engage in a deeper conversation around what outreach ministries do you have. People are pretty comfortable with that. They're more comfortable sometimes with writing a check or helping to serve a meal or pack or work in a garden, that type of thing. That's meaningful work. And to reflect on the goals of that work. Why are you doing this? Not just as, I'm called by my faith to, but even more specific than that. Yeah. What are the goals of this garden? Are we meeting a hunger need? Are we meeting a community engagement need? What is it? And how can you pursue those same goals through advocacy? How do you bring advocacy into this? How do the experiences, the expertise, the knowledge of our outreach ministries, how can that be useful to our elected officials at the city, for the city council, for our state legislatures? The Episcopal Church runs one of 9 refugee resettlement agencies that contract with the federal government to resettle refugees. Right. And that's an expertise that we can bring into conversations to keep members of Congress informed on what a refugee even is. We can't assume that everyone has the same level of understanding on a topic. And so even that is valuable and can be considered quote unquote advocacy. So it's not just saying vote yes, vote no. It is saying, how do we solve this together? How do we bring in our resources to this together? So to get around maybe more specifically to then why advocacy, we usually list 3 particular reasons. And we do this from the perspective of the federal government, although it could apply to the state and local level as well. The first is scripture, which we already reviewed. The second is scale. Especially for the federal government, the scale of impact is just much larger than we can have as individual nonprofits. One of the best examples of that, or 2 perhaps, would be addressing environmental concerns and environmental impact. We can certainly reduce our impact on the environment as churches, as individuals. But to have an even greater impact on reversing the direction we're going with climate change, environmental degradation, federal advocacy is important. I think it's like 5% of funding for hunger relief domestically in the U.S. comes from charitable organizations. That's all churches, all secular organizations combined. The rest comes from the federal government. So that doesn't mean we should stop doing, the funding that we do, but to have a scale greater, we need to have a say, and we need to be speaking out in how our resources are used.
Yeah, I think we ought to let that settle in just for a minute.
Yeah.
So did you hear that? If we say it one more time.
So I think it's 5% of funding comes from all charitable organizations, and the federal government provides the rest.
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about that's why. I mean, it's 95% of not even what we need, but it's 95% of what we have to make a difference, and the need's even greater, right? So we have to work on that level if we really care.
And one addition to that, which gets to the government relations piece and not just simply advocacy, is that even though that's the funding answer, churches and other nonprofits often implement programs that are funded by the federal government. And so the funding may come from elsewhere, but we're on the ground actually engaging in many ways. And then the third reason, scripture, scale, the third reason is authority. And so for some issues, whether it's the federal government, the state government, even the local at times, if we want to engage on certain issues, those are the only authorities that actually deal with that issue, and so we have to engage with them. Immigration is the best example. Certainly there are examples of sanctuary cities, sanctuary parishes even. That's needed at times, but that's not going to change legislation and the fundamental structures of our immigration system. I mentioned refugee resettlement. Right. That has to be approved. The number of refugees we let in is approved by the presidential administration. So the thousands of Episcopalians that help resettle refugees through Episcopal Migration Ministries, none of that work could happen if the federal government program went away. We could not independently say, okay, refugees from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, or the ones who have been waiting in the process for sometimes 15 years, we cannot individually as an institution bring them into the United States. It requires that engagement. So Scripture, scale, and authority are really the three reasons, I think, to be involved.
Thank you. Before we open up to Q&A, let's talk about where your office is focused on upcoming legislation.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question anytime, but especially leading up to an election. And who knows which way, if either side of Congress, the House or the Senate, may switch from Democrat control to Republican control. At the end of the day, from our perspective, the work may get easier or harder depending on that, and depending on the issue. So the time between now and the election day, November 8th, there may not be a whole lot happening, or there could be some surprises along the way. Then in what's called the lame duck session, between then and the start of the new congressional session in January, it may be more interesting. We may see some things move forward where members are, they're not worried as much about the immediate vote, because that's already happened, and so they may be willing to take chances. Just one example, because it's in a portfolio that I cover. So I do our church relations work, and then I cover voting, our voter engagement, any sort of government partnerships like healthcare, universal healthcare enrollment through the Affordable Health Care Act. I did our 2020 census engagement because we were a formal partner for the 2020 census. Our COVID vaccine toolkit, helping the government roll out the COVID vaccines. Where was I going with this? I've lost my train of thought. Voting elections. And then for advocacy, I cover voting rights legislation, some of our racial justice portfolio, in particular the 13th Amendment, changes to the 13th Amendment, reparations, and then I cover our foreign policy to Haiti. But on the voting rights piece, it's been a topic pretty frequently in the past couple of years, and there were two big pieces of legislation that we saw fail in the Senate at the beginning of this year. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would effectively address what was overturned in the Supreme Court ruling in, was that 2012 or 2013, that effectively repealed a big part of the Voting Rights Act from the 60s. And then the Freedom to Vote Act, I think was the new term, which covered, a dozen or more different aspects of elections and democracy. Both of those bills did not move forward. And so we supported them. Our church policies support them. That's an example of the what. This is what we want ultimately, but then how do we get there? Do we get there through just yelling and screaming louder and louder in hopes that somehow that'll make people change their vote and it'll pass? Maybe that's not their most effective way. Maybe we need to rethink it. Can it be broken down? Even if these things are intersectional, can we have different pieces that we can move forward? And so one of those pieces would be reform to the Electoral Count Act. You all may have heard about it. It's been in the news the past couple of weeks because it actually, so there was a bipartisan group of senators with a pretty wide political spectrum on both sides of the aisle that produced the bill for reforms to the Electoral Count Act. The House came up with their own version and passed it very quickly, which has kind of made the two chambers upset at each other because the Senate put a lot of work into this and the bills are not the same. So there'll have to be some reconciliation in the two versions before it becomes law, but the goal is to get that passed before the end of the year. And for background on that topic, in case you're interested, the Electoral Count Act came up because of the attempts to overturn the election and the events on January 6th in 2020. And the Electoral Count Act itself, though, is from the late 1800s, and it was a response to a contested presidential election in the late 1800s that took advantage of a lack of clarity in how to, basically, it's a little simplification here, a lack of clarity in how to count states' electors. And so there were multiple counts. I can't remember if it was from more than one state or not, but there were basically multiple counts of electors presented to the federal government, and there was no means of determining which of those counts was the accurate one. And so that's what that bill addressed. Unfortunately, it's still not clear enough. And that's what we saw essentially exploited in 2020. And Vice President Mike Pence did not, again, oversimplification here to an extent, didn't go along with that. And so this bill is meant to offer those clarifications, to raise the threshold of the number of members of Congress it takes to challenge a state's electors, to clarify the role of the vice president in that process, to clarify a number of procedural issues throughout actually counting and certifying the vote. So that's a big piece of legislation. It does not cover by any means all of the voting rights legislation we would like to see, but we think it can move forward. We think it has a shot. It has a shot because it's bipartisan. It has very clear support from both sides of the aisle. And in fact, Mitch McConnell, I think the most recent news on it is that Mitch McConnell came out in support of the bill. So there are more than enough votes in the Senate now, assuming all Democrats vote for it, to pass the filibuster threshold. So that's one example for the fall.
So as we open it for Q&A, I must say, we just did all that in about 30 minutes. Alan, you're most impressive. We covered a lot of ground, and you're both succinct and wise simultaneously. That's just great. Much, much thanks. Tony is going to come around with questions. If you've got a question, I want you to raise your hand. He's going to come around with a microphone. And if you'll speak into the microphone, just the whole room.
Well, thank you for that. And I have amazing colleagues to rely on as well. So part of the beauty of my role is I get to represent their work too in doing this. So a lot of people sort of know me as the face in some ways, at least in the church. But yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that compliment. Yeah.
Alan, as you look to, let's say, 2030, what issue do you see needing the most attention that it's not getting currently?
You may need to ask, can you ask that one more time, holding the mic up a little bit?
Sure. As you look forward to, say, 2030, so the end of the current decade, what is the issue that you think is not getting enough attention that needs more attention?
That's a really good question, and it may depend on where. I mean, I'm trying to decide what I should comment on and what I shouldn't. Where we have church policies, I think matters of the environment really need more attention and focus. I mean, we just continue to, it's not that the distractions are on unnecessary things or things that aren't real problems by any means, but we do continue to be sidetracked on different conversations, and we continue to kind of overlook a proactive take at climate change, at environmental degradation, at resource depletion. And so that's probably what I would raise up as number one. And that's a broad topic. It's one that has, so when I say I cover, sort of racial justice issues, the two I mentioned, reparations and the 13th Amendment, are very narrow. They're almost only a racial justice issue. So for everything else, we kind of use it as a lens. It may not work in every situation, but we can consider what are the racial justice implications of not addressing this environmental problem. What are the racial justice implications of this immigration policy? And so it's something that touches everything else. Environmental issues, I mean, it's something that touches everything else. But I think we've got to be focusing more on that. It's a national security issue. There are different ways to approach it, right? Using different vocabulary. It doesn't just have to be, to simplify things, I'm, an environmentalist in Colorado and I care about the trees. That's great. It can also be, this is in our national security interest, and that may appeal to a different set of people, and suddenly you see yourselves engaging in a conversation that you may not otherwise would have had before.
Thank you very much for your discussion. I'd like to know to what extent you think what's been emerging as the Christian national movement affected, co-opted, or sabotaged a faith-based message as we advocate in the public arena.
That's to an extent an example of where sometimes the more radical, the more flashy headline gets attention and it gets amplified. And sometimes that turns into kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, or maybe that's not quite the right term. It draws its own energy in because of that. And I think that's part of what's happening there. But a couple of things to that. We always encourage Episcopalians, and we do so in our own capacity as well, to upfront say, I'm a constituent, you're my representative, you're my senators, and I'm speaking to you as an Episcopalian. I'm speaking to you as a person of faith. And to do that repeatedly, over and over again. And I think that's critical, so that there is this exposure of, there are other faith voices out there. There's a very, very rich diversity of faith voices out there that each have their own meaningful contributions that are not that. That said, we have joined and signed on to Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I don't know if anyone in the room has heard of that initiative or organization. Highly recommend you check it out. I believe you all can even sign on as individuals, and they have resources to that end. And we were commissioned by Executive Council, which is the board of the church, to do a report on de-radicalization. And that also is now publicly available on our website. So there are a couple of ways that we have been engaging with that. It's a problem, and a scary one. Yeah. Yep, it is. And, I think I don't want to be too naive or optimistic, but I do really like the number of faith organizations we're able to work with in DC. And the constituencies, their respective church constituencies or faith-based constituencies, they're not all Christian, that they represent. And we have had great success on some topics working with the National Association of Evangelicals or even the Southern Baptist Convention's Advocacy office. We've worked with them a couple of times very, very effectively over the last 5 or 6 years. So they're good examples of that, but they do get marginalized. It's not as visible. And so I think that I'm not saying it's either or, I think it's both and. It is Christian nationalism is a serious problem. I think it is growing. And also, I think we need to raise up a way to combat it in a way is to raise up the positive, to raise up, this is where good work is happening. These are actually good faith-based people who are out here with the best interests of their communities and everyone in their communities in their intentions and in their work. Yeah.
In your communications or the church's communications with Congress, do we use lobbyists?
Can I use lobbyists?
Do we use lobbyists?
Typically, no. So we are not registered lobbyists, and so there's in part a legal distinction for that. So lobbying is, and this is not official legal advice, in case you're wanting to do something as an institution here at the cathedral. But lobbying is encouraging a vote for or against a piece of legislation. That's very narrow. That's different from, hey, we run a refugee resettlement agency, you're on the appropriations committee, can we talk to you about what is needed in the refugee resettlement space? It's a very different conversation, and that's more advocacy. So we emphasize the advocacy piece, we emphasize the government relations piece, and don't really use the word lobbying, even though at times, and certainly in some of our action alerts that we send out through the Episcopal Public Policy Network, those often mention specific pieces of legislation. That is, in a sense, lobbying, but we don't typically use that term. So it's a small distinction, but an important one, and a legal one of consequence for nonprofits as well.
So thinking about this question of how, as opposed to what, are there any instances where our instincts about how to get to a stated goal might be naive or mistaken? So I'm thinking about, specific examples of like Band-Aid-like solutions that might seem like appealing to us, but that from your perspective, you could see are counterproductive.
Yeah, so I'll use this as an opportunity to plug our civil discourse curriculum, which I helped create. I think we discussed a question before about my favorite part of my job. It's probably implementing that curriculum, but it's available for you. You can take it online as an individual. It's kind of like a masterclass style course. We did it in partnership with Church Next. The reason why I mentioned that is because we talk about a couple of examples, like you mentioned, where we need to be aware of the complexities of policymaking. One of the things I like to underline is that almost any policy we're advocating for is accepting a particular set of benefits and consequences. Almost no policy is without consequence. I can't even think of an example. And it may be, okay, we want universal health care, let's get it passed. The consequence is, how do we pay for it? Do we raise taxes? And so consequence has a wide definition there, perhaps. But one I was actually just discussing the other day is around something called, it's an example of the Cobra Effect. Is anyone here familiar with that term? So I'm seeing some shaking heads. So in British colonial rule I think it was in Delhi, India, during British colonial rule, there was a problem of cobras, like on the street, snakes. And so the colonial rulers said, okay, we're going to put a bounty on the head of these snakes. If you kill a snake and turn it in, you'll get a financial reward. That incentivized people to then become cobra breeders. And so people would raise snakes, cut their heads off, turn them in, and get a reward. And of course, the powers that be couldn't stand that anymore, so we're going to terminate the policy, which eliminated any incentive to keep the cobras around. And so people released them back into the street. And so you ended up with more cobras after the policy was implemented than you had beforehand. That was a long time ago. The recent example is gun buyback programs. I saw a news headline the other day. Someone printed, I think, like 20 or 30 3D guns and then turned them in and made like $19,000 or $20,000 because he printed the guns and turned them in and got the reward. So there are things like that happen. Another piece drawing from that curriculum is there's a whole section on values and beginning our conversation from a place of values. I won't go into that in particular, but what I note, one of the points in that is that sometimes, we each hold a set of values, and there are realities where fulfilling two or more values may actually put them in conflict with one another. Where fulfilling one means harming the other or falling short in another. And one example, although I think, I want to speak true to what our church policies are, but this is an example where we've gotten a critique from folks on the left. There's an area called Oak Flat. It is considered of great importance to the indigenous communities around that area, but it also has a rich copper deposit. And so we have policy against mining in Oak Flat because that process would destroy the land and is against the wishes and the desires of the indigenous people there. The issue is that for going back to climate change of the environment, we need copper for a lot of quote-unquote green energy. And so if we need copper, we've got to get it from somewhere, and wherever we get it from, it's going to hurt that land. And so if we're wanting to both be environmentalists and support indigenous people and indigenous rights, that's a hard call, right? It suddenly gets very, very complicated. So there are a lot of those examples. And that's also where I think, going back to the bipartisan piece, talking to people across the aisle is so helpful. It's needed. We have to get outside of our bubbles because we'll miss things like that. And miss how, rather than just getting frustrated because my partisan perspective is coming up against your partisan perspective and we're mad at each other, taking a step back and saying, what do we actually want? What is complicating this? And how can we bring our resources together to solve it? I don't know if there are any other questions, but are there other questions? Because I have one more example. Other question? No? Yeah.
Thank you. I am curious about some of the practicalities. Where can folks go to learn kind of a list of Episcopal stances on a variety of issues? Because as you mentioned, it comes up in convention, but rather than having to sift through each year's convention notes, is there a comprehensive place where we can find out about the Episcopal Church stance on a lot of these issues? As also kind of part of that, what does advocacy from your office look like in regional advocacy? For example, water rights in Colorado is a much bigger issue than in Washington, D.C. What does that look like for us here?
Sure, that's good. Two good questions. The first one, not a terrific answer, although I think our own website is a great resource for things that we've at least been... It changes depending on what legislation and policies we've been calling action on to an extent, because that's what we're going to feature on our website most prominently. But again, episcopalchurch.org/OGR. But that's not comprehensive of all churches' policies. I think the oldest that I've referenced, I think it was the 50s. I think either the 1940s or 1950s have referenced policies from then. So there's no time limit on a church policy unless it's changed by a convention. But on our website are links to Episcopal Archives search engines, so it's marginally better than sifting through the notes of all conventions. But there is one search engine for General Convention resolutions and one search engine for Executive Council resolves, both of which carry equal weight in terms of the advocacy of our office, but you can't search them together. And sometimes, as you all are probably familiar, terminology changes over the years. And so you may have to try some synonyms in those searches to find a policy that's actually in the area you want. And then we also have a resource called Policy for Action, which hopefully will release soon. We have at least the draft done. I need to do the formatting at some point. That lists all of the policies, and they're kind of categorized. We actually have it updated with links now. The old version did not have links into it that went to the full text. So those resources are there. Now I'm forgetting your second question. Regional. So, that's trickier and not a great, I don't have a great answer for it, in that our office is tasked with representing the church's positions to the federal government, federal U.S. government. And we're limited to that. That said, our advocacy trainings, our voter engagement work, some of the basic advocacy resources that we have on our website are useful at any level. It's the same basic practices. What do you want? Who can make the change that you want to see? Where are they? How do you contact them? Some of those same basic, approaches to advocacy are the same whether it's with your city council, state legislature, or the U.S. federal government, or your church leadership even. So those could be helpful, but we don't have a network of state-level advocacy organizations in the same way that the ELCA does, for example. It's just not where General Convention has directed resources. Yep.
There's time for one more if there is one. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping before we thank Alan. So one thing that comes to mind is the cathedral's played a leading role in hosting 2 different March for Our Lives in relation to gun legislation. And when we do that, among other things, we always work with our friends and partners in the ELCA, the Lutheran Church, and their diocese, and their diocese or region in the West, and the Methodists. And the Methodist, Lutheran, and Episcopal bishops all in this area have a great relationship too. And I think that's really, really important. The ELCA justice officer is someone named Peter, and I forget, do you remember Peter's last name? Yeah. And those of you have all heard Peter sing because he's in our choir. I forget his last name, but he's their justice officer, and we always work with Peter on advocacy statements and on gatherings that relate to justice and such. So, that's been really important in this diocese in the last few years, last several years, working with all those bishops. Second is, did an advocacy statement yesterday or 2 days ago that went out in The Voice. We tend to stay focused on local issues or state issues for obvious reasons. But we did an advocacy statement, did one on a piece of upcoming federal legislation, which is the 2023 Farm Bill. And long story short, you can participate in this. We're going to be the host site 2 weeks from today at 2 p.m. right here in Dagwell. Bread for the World, a great nonprofit organization, is going to do a conversation about the 2023 Farm Bill, how important it is, and ask for your ideas and opinions on that. We'll also be joined by representatives from the Colorado Council of Churches. Again, that's the 16th of this month at 2 o'clock in here. Finally, the group, just so many people at the cathedral, so many of you are involved in all of these questions in your own day jobs, in your own personal lives and neighborhoods. Please know, I never think that the people who are involved in justice are the people who are on our FIA committee. I mean, you all are doing profound work in the world, and it's undoubtedly the most important work that goes on in the name of the cathedral. But if you're looking to be a part of a smaller group that does this regularly in the name of the cathedral and works on plans for the cathedral, Faith in Action is probably our best commission that does that. We're always looking for 2 or 3 new people at the beginning of every year. They meet monthly except for July and December. It's a great group. If you ever wanted to be an FIA, let me know. I'm the liaison to that committee. And then we also have a grants committee. They're more involved. Yes, they give away money, but they're also involved in conversations with nonprofits in the Denver metro area as they make their application. So it's not just giving away money, it's actually getting to know these partners, helping to vet them in some ways, and helping to raise up some of the smaller ones in addition to the bigger ones like Metro Care and St. Francis Center. So if you ever wanted to be involved in FIA or grants, just let me know. I'm liaison to both of those as well. And then last but not least, let's thank Alan. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And as we break, truly, Alan, God bless your work. God bless you. And just a profound thanks for your eloquence, your precision, your appreciation of nuance, and above all, your not just your care for justice in the world, but your care for this